Officer had been patrolling the industrial district of Richmond, Virginia for nearly 12 years. He'd seen everything: abandoned warehouses become havens for criminals, homeless encampments spring up and fade away, businesses board up their windows as the neighborhood slowly deteriorated. But on this particular sweltering July afternoon, with temperatures hovering around 95 degrees and humidity making every breath feel like drowning in invisible water, was ready for his shift to end. He'd already filled his quota of incident reports, broken up a minor dispute between two shop owners, and written 3 traffic citations. All he wanted was to grab a cold drink, head home to his modest apartment, and collapse in front of the air conditioning unit that had been working overtime all week. As was driving through the textile warehouse district, turning onto 5th Street to make one final loop before heading to the station, dispatch crackled to life. All units, we have reports of a disturbance at the old Riverside Mill. Multiple callers reporting a dog acting aggressively, chasing vehicles. Proceed with caution. Sighed, a dog call. These were always unpredictable and frustrating. He'd responded to dozens of stray dog incidents throughout his career, and they rarely ended well. Either the animal control van would show up late, or the dog would bolt into an inaccessible area, or worst case scenario, the situation would escalate into something dangerous. But duty was duty, and had built his entire career on responsiveness. He was the officer other officers wanted to work with because he showed up, he paid attention, and he cared deeply about the outcomes of his calls. He pulled his cruiser into the industrial park near the old textile mill, a massive brick structure that had been abandoned for nearly a decade. The area was desolate, no pedestrians, minimal traffic, just cracked pavement and broken dreams. And then he saw her. A dog was darting between parked cars with frantic, jerky movements, her coat a mixture of matted brown and gray fur that suggested she hadn't seen proper grooming in months. From a distance could see she was severely emaciated, her body frame visible beneath her tattered fur like a living skeleton. Her movements were almost manic, running toward the warehouse, then spinning around and running back toward the street, barking at passing vehicles with increasing desperation. Her back left leg dragged slightly as she moved, suggesting either an old injury or active pain. What struck most profoundly, however, wasn't her physical condition, it was her eyes. Even from a distance, he could see they burned with fierce, desperate intensity. This wasn't a dog simply lost or confused. This wasn't an animal acting out of hunger or territorial instinct. This was something else entirely. This was desperation of a different caliber. This was a mother in crisis. Had a daughter, 12-year-old Emma, who lived with his ex-wife but stayed with him every other weekend. He'd witnessed firsthand the primal intensity of maternal instinct when Emma was born, the way his ex-wife had shifted from vulnerable human to fierce protector in moments. He recognized something of that same ferocious determination in this dog's frantic movements. Instead of approaching directly, parked his cruiser carefully and stepped out slowly. He kept his body language open and non-threatening, the way he'd been trained in animal behavior seminars. The dog's head whipped around and for a moment thought she might attack. Her teeth bared. She crouched slightly, muscles tensing. But then something shifted in her expression. She seemed to study him, to assess whether he represented a threat or a potential solution. Knelt down slowly, making himself smaller and less intimidating. "Hey girl," he called out softly. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's ears perked forward, her aggressive posture softened infinitesimally. She took 2 tentative steps toward him, then stopped. She looked back at the warehouse, then back at the warehouse again. Her body language communicated something that transcended the species barrier. Please, I need your help, please. This internal conflict was evident in every trembling muscle of her exhausted body. She wanted to approach, wanted to trust him, but she couldn't risk leaving whatever she was protecting. It was an impossible situation for her, the need for help warring against the need to remain vigilant, to stay close to whatever she was guarding. Remained motionless, giving her space to decide. His years of police work had taught him patience. He'd learned that often the breakthrough came not from aggressive action but from quiet presence. Minutes passed. Sweat ran down his temple in the oppressive heat. A few cars passed by on the adjacent street but didn't move. He simply waited. Finally, something shifted. The dog took a determined step toward him, then another. She moved with a limp that suggested she was experiencing genuine pain with each step, yet she persisted. When she reached, she did something extraordinary. Instead of sniffing his hand or attempting to interact normally, she grabbed his pant leg firmly between her teeth and pulled. She was tugging him urgently, pulling him toward the warehouse with all the strength her malnourished body could muster. Understood immediately. Whatever was in that warehouse, whatever she was protecting, was important enough for her to risk trusting a stranger. "All right, girl," said, standing slowly. Show me what's so important." She pulled harder, her nails scraping against the pavement as she dragged him forward. They moved toward the rear of the abandoned warehouse where decades of neglect had created hidden corners and forgotten spaces. His heart was racing now, adrenaline flooding his system. What was he about to discover? Was it something dangerous, an illegal operation, human trafficking, or was it something else entirely? The dog led him around a corner to an area shadowed by the building's massive brick walls. Behind a pile of discarded pallets and old machinery, partially concealed by overgrown weeds and scattered trash, could see it, a cardboard box carefully positioned against the warehouse wall. The box had been lined with old newspapers and what appeared to be torn fabric, creating a makeshift nest. And from inside that box came a sound that would forever change the trajectory of this story. The faint, pitiful whimpering of a puppy. Froze, his eyes moved from the box to the mother dog, whose entire body was now trembling, whether from fear, exhaustion, or emotion, he couldn't determine. She released his pant leg and moved protectively in front of the box, positioning herself between and her precious cargo. Her eyes, though sunken from malnutrition, blazed with protective ferocity. In that moment, Officer understood that he was witnessing something profound. This wasn't just an abandoned dog. This wasn't just an animal struggling to survive. This was an extraordinary act of maternal love that transcended the boundaries of species and survival instinct. This was a mother who had endured unimaginable hardship, injury, starvation, homelessness, and had chosen to create new life anyway. And then she had managed, against all odds, to keep that new life alive. Felt moisture gathering in his eyes, his throat tightened. He'd been trained to remain objective, professional, and detached in his work, but standing there in the oppressive heat, looking at this desperate mother and her tiny, fragile baby, he realized that professionalism and compassion didn't have to be mutually exclusive. "Oh, Mama," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What have you been through, and how have you possibly kept going?" The question hung in the humid air, unanswered but understood. Knew that he stood at a crossroads. What he did in the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of these two animals, but would set in motion a chain of events that neither he nor they could possibly anticipate. The desperate mother dog, her tiny puppy, and one compassionate police officer were about to become entangled in a story that would eventually inspire thousands and change lives across an entire nation. Approached the cardboard box with deliberate slowness, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no threat. The mother dog had already begun thinking of her as Honey because of her burnished tan and brown coloring, positioned herself more firmly in front of the box, her body rigid with protective intensity. Her growl was weak and hoarse, barely audible, which somehow made it more heartbreaking. She was so depleted, so utterly exhausted, that even her warning growl couldn't muster genuine ferocity. Yet she stood her ground anyway, ready to defend her baby with whatever remained of her shattered strength. "It's okay, Mama," whispered, keeping his voice soft and rhythmic. "I'm not here to hurt your baby. I promise you that. I'm going to help. Please let me help." He didn't know if the dog understood his words, probably she didn't, but animals responded to tone and intention and had perfected the art of communicating calm reassurance through his voice. Gradually, Honey's rigid posture relaxed slightly. She didn't move away from the box, but she ceased her growling. Her breathing, though still labored, seemed to ease marginally. Crouched beside the box, keeping a respectful distance. Inside, on a bed of old newspapers and what appeared to be pieces of torn blanket, lay the tiniest puppy had ever seen. The creature couldn't have been more than 4 to 5 weeks old, with eyes barely open and fur so matted and filthy that it was impossible to determine the original color. The puppy's body was skeletal, every rib visible, its stomach sunken inward in a way that indicated severe malnutrition. Yet despite its obvious suffering, the small creature whimpered and moved toward its mother, seeking comfort and nourishment. Eyes burned with unshed tears. He'd been on the police force for 12 years. He'd responded to domestic violence calls that left him shaken. He'd attended training sessions about human trafficking and the depths of cruelty people could inflict on one another. He'd seen homelessness, addiction, and despair in forms that had tested his faith in humanity. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the emotional weight of this moment. This wasn't human suffering, which somehow seemed more explicable in the context of human complexity. This was an animal, a creature without language, without the ability to advocate for herself, without resources or understanding, who had endured unimaginable hardship while protecting new life. "How did you get here, girl?" murmured, more to himself than to Honey. "Where did you come from, and how have you managed to keep going?" He was so focused on the heartbreaking scene before him that he almost didn't notice the figure emerging from behind a nearby pile of discarded machinery. His hand instinctively moved toward his weapon before his brain caught up with his reflexes, but the figure posed no threat. It was a man, probably in his early 60s, with weathered skin, a gray beard, and clothes that had been washed so many times they'd become almost translucent. He carried a battered backpack and held a plastic bag containing what appeared to be leftover food from a restaurant dumpster. "Don't worry," the man said, raising his hands peacefully. "I'm not trouble. I've just been keeping an eye on her for the past couple of weeks." Relaxed his stance but remained alert. "You know this dog?" "I know of her," the man replied, moving carefully closer. Name's Daniel. I've been homeless for about 6 years and I camp in this area sometimes. I first saw her about 3 months ago. She was hit by a car right there on 5th Street. I saw the whole thing." He pointed vaguely toward the street. "She got clipped pretty good by a sedan. I thought she was dead, honestly, but she got up after a few minutes and she just kept moving like she was determined not to die." I felt something tighten in his chest. 3 months. She's been out here for 3 months. "At least," Daniel confirmed, nodding grimly. "And that's just since I've been observing her. Who knows how long before that. I started leaving her scraps when I could find them, mostly from the restaurant dumpsters back there." He gestured toward a nearby building. "She was always skittish, wouldn't let me get close, but about 2 months ago something changed. She stopped running from me. I realized she was pregnant. I've been doing what I can, but—" He trailed off, his eyes moving to the puppy. "I'm just one old homeless guy. I can barely feed myself." Listened intently, his detective's mind cataloging every detail. "Tell me everything you know about her condition. The injury, how bad was it?" Daniel moved closer and in the harsh afternoon light could see the genuine compassion and distress in the older man's weathered features. "Her back left leg is the worst. The car caught her there pretty solid. I could see the wound was infected for weeks. She was limping bad, limping so bad sometimes I'd watch her collapse from the pain. But she never gave up. She just kept moving, kept searching for food, kept surviving." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then about 8 weeks ago, I noticed she'd gone missing for a few days. I thought maybe she'd finally succumbed to her injuries, but then I saw her again and she was pregnant. Somehow, while dealing with that infected leg, while starving, while homeless, she'd managed to mate and become pregnant." "Jesus," whispered, running a hand through his hair. "About 6 weeks ago, she had the puppy," Daniel continued. "I was nearby when it happened. She gave birth right there in an alley behind those old storefronts." He pointed toward a distant corner of the industrial park. "I watched her lick that tiny thing clean, watched her somehow produce milk despite being malnourished herself. It was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Pure instinct, pure survival, pure love, if you believe dogs can feel that." "How did they end up here?" asked, gesturing toward the sheltered spot behind the warehouse. "I helped her move them," Daniel admitted. "The alley wasn't safe. Rats, other animals, occasional foot traffic from people not so friendly. I suggested this spot. It's more protected, shadowed most of the day so it's cooler, and it's somewhat hidden from casual observation. I've been bringing her what food I can scavenge, but—" He looked at Honey with profound sadness. "She's dying, officer. I don't want to be dramatic, but I think she's dying. She's gotten worse just in the past week or two. She's not eating much anymore. She's weaker. I think she's using whatever strength she has left to produce milk for that puppy, and there's just nothing left for her." Knelt closer to Honey, carefully examining her without touching. Now that Daniel had pointed it out, he could see the truth of it. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her eyes, though intelligent and aware, had a glazed quality that suggested shock or severe illness. When she shifted her weight, she winced visibly. Her coat was dull and matted, with patches of missing fur revealing skin beneath. The scarring on her left rear leg was extensive and clearly infected. Even from a distance, could see the inflammation and detect a faint smell of infection. "How long do you think she has?" asked quietly. Daniel was silent for a long moment. "Without medical help, I'd say weeks, maybe less. Her body is just breaking down. She's held on this long through sheer force of will, but that can only take you so far." He looked at with desperate hope in his eyes. "Can you help her? You're a cop. You have resources, right? Can you get her to a vet?" met the homeless man's gaze and saw the same desperation reflected there that he'd seen in Honey's eyes. Here was a man with nothing, living hand to mouth, yet his primary concern was for an animal he'd taken it upon himself to help. There was something profound about that, something that spoke to the depths of human compassion that could emerge even in the darkest circumstances. "I'm going to try," said firmly. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'm going to try everything I can." As if understanding that something pivotal was happening, Honey lifted her head and made eye contact with. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that this human represented either her last hope or her final doom. Her entire body trembled and she moved slightly to the side, just enough to reveal her puppy more completely. It was an act of trust and vulnerability, a mother showing her baby to a stranger and saying, without words, "I'm putting my faith in you. Please don't let us down." Felt the weight of that responsibility settle across his shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't just about saving two animals anymore. This was about honoring the incredible resilience and love he was witnessing. This was about proving that compassion and action could triumph over circumstance. Sat in his police cruiser with the engine running and the air conditioning blasting, though the cold air did nothing to dispel the heat rising from his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he stared at his phone, wrestling with a decision that felt far more consequential than any call he'd made in his 12-year career. It was 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. His shift officially ended at 5:00 p.m. In 13 minutes, he would either follow protocol or take an unconventional path that could have serious professional consequences. The standard procedure was clear and well established: call animal control. Richmond Animal Services maintained a facility designed specifically for this situation. They had trained staff, medical equipment, and proper protocols for handling strays, had called them dozens of times over the years. The process was familiar. He would make the call, fill out a report, document the location, and let the professionals handle it. Case closed, by the book, no complications. No personal investment beyond the initial call. But couldn't shake the image from his mind: Honey's sunken eyes, the trembling of her emaciated body, the way she'd positioned herself protectively in front of her puppy despite being in agony. And he couldn't ignore the information Daniel had shared, information that was burning in his brain like a warning beacon. Knew Richmond's animal shelter situation intimately. He'd done a community outreach presentation there 6 months ago. The facility, built in 1987 to handle a capacity of approximately 150 animals, was currently housing nearly 200. The director at that time had been overwhelmed and underfunded, had heard through the grapevine that there'd been recent turnover in leadership, but he didn't know the current situation. What he did know from conversations with other officers was that the shelter was perpetually overcrowded, chronically underfunded, and forced to make devastating decisions about which animals could be saved and which couldn't. If he called animal control right now, Honey and Pip would be taken to that facility. They would receive basic medical attention, probably. The shelter would attempt to find them adopters, or they would languish in cages while the facility tried to manage a population that exceeded its resources. And if Honey's medical condition proved too expensive to treat, if she required extensive veterinary care that strained the already limited budget, what then? Had heard stories. Horrible stories about difficult decisions made in overcrowded shelters. He couldn't unsee those stories now, couldn't pretend they didn't exist. His phone sat in his lap, the contacts app open. He scrolled to animal control and hesitated. His thumb hovered over the number. Then he stopped and scrolled further. He'd seen something during his community outreach visit, a name, a recent hire, a new director, someone with apparent passion and ideas about reform. Searched his memory, scrolling through his mental files of that presentation day. Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She'd asked thoughtful questions during his presentation. She'd seemed genuinely invested in improving community police collaboration. She'd written her email on a card and handed it to him, saying, "If you ever encounter situations where we could work together more effectively, please contact me directly." Had kept that card. It was somewhere in his cruiser, he thought. He searched the cup holders, the door pockets, the glove compartment, nothing, but he could find her easily enough. He called directory assistance and obtained the direct number for Richmond Animal Care and Control. When the receptionist answered, asked specifically for Dr. Mitchell. "I'm sorry, she's not available," the receptionist said in the practiced tone of someone fielding calls all day. "She's currently in a staff meeting. May I take a message?" "This is Officer with Richmond Police Department," said, adding a note of urgency to his voice. "This is time-sensitive. I have an emergency animal situation that requires her immediate attention. Can you interrupt the meeting?" There was a pause, could almost hear the receptionist debating the intrusion. Finally, she said, "Hold, please." The hold music played, something generic and tinny, and felt his heart hammering. He was committing now. He was stepping outside normal channels. If this didn't work, if Dr. Mitchell was unhelpful or unavailable, he'd have to call animal control anyway, and he'd look like someone trying to circumvent the system. Insubordination, lack of respect for established procedures, career-limiting moves. But then a voice came on the line. "This is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I understand you have an emergency." Took a deep breath and began explaining. He described Honey's condition with clinical precision, the infected leg injury, the severe malnutrition, the signs of shock, the advanced illness. He described Pip's condition. He explained the timeline, 3 months of survival against impossible odds, a mother sacrificing everything to keep her baby alive. He described the maternal devotion he'd witnessed, the act of protection and trust. He explained Daniel's assessment that without immediate medical intervention, both animals would likely die within weeks, possibly sooner. "I understand if this is outside normal protocol," concluded, "but I'm asking if there's any possibility you could prioritize these 2 animals. They're at the old Riverside Mill behind the warehouse. I can transport them immediately." There was silence on the line, could almost hear Dr. Mitchell thinking, processing, considering. Then she said something that shocked him. "Officer, thank you for calling me directly. Thank you for caring enough to step outside the usual channels. Yes, absolutely yes. Bring them in immediately. I'm going to clear a quiet recovery room right now. These animals will receive full medical attention, and I personally guarantee that they will not be euthanized or turned away, regardless of the medical costs or complications." I felt his throat tighten. "You're sure?" "Completely sure," Dr. Mitchell said with conviction. "I came to this position specifically to reform our practices. Animals like this, animals who survived against impossible odds, animals with stories as profound as what you're describing, they deserve every resource we have. Bring them to me. Now." After disconnecting, sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then adrenaline flooded his system. He had a mission now, a purpose that superseded the ordinary. He pulled up to the warehouse and radioed dispatch to inform them he was handling the animal situation and would be off the clock shortly. Back at the warehouse, gathered supplies from his cruiser, blankets, water bottles, towels. Daniel helped him construct makeshift carriers from plastic storage containers he found behind the warehouse. They worked with careful urgency, mindful that they were trying to save lives that were quite literally running out of time. When approached Honey to gently guide her toward the first carrier, she didn't resist. If anything, she seemed to understand that something was happening, that this human was offering an alternative to certain death. She allowed him to lift her, surprisingly light, disturbingly fragile, and place her in the carrier. Her eyes tracked his movements with intelligent awareness. Then came Pip, gently lifted the tiny puppy who whimpered but didn't struggle. He placed Pip in a separate carrier, lined carefully with blankets to provide comfort and security. "Thank you," Daniel said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you for not giving up on her, for not just making the easy call." "Thank you for caring for them," replied. "You probably saved their lives by moving them here, by bringing them food, by watching out for them." As loaded the carriers into his police cruiser, something extraordinary was about to happen, an event that would become the pivotal moment of this entire story. Something that would transform a rescue operation into a symbol of maternal love and desperation. Something that would capture the hearts of millions and inspire a movement. But didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he was racing against time, driving as quickly as safety allowed toward the animal shelter, carrying two fragile lives that had already beaten impossible odds but were running out of time. The sun was beginning to set over Richmond, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, indifferent to the drama unfolding on the city streets below. The drive to Richmond Animal Care and Control Facility normally took 15 minutes from the industrial district. Made it in 11, navigating traffic with practiced efficiency while maintaining enough caution to avoid causing accidents. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every congested intersection tested his patience. He kept glancing in his mirror at the carriers secured in the back of his cruiser, listening for any sign of distress from his passengers. Honey had been quiet, ominously quiet. Her silence worried more than if she'd been struggling or crying out. That silence suggested resignation, exhaustion, the kind of quiet that comes from a body that has simply given up fighting. Pip had whimpered occasionally, small, pitiful sounds that tugged its heart. Found himself talking to them as he drove, offering words of reassurance and encouragement that he hoped might somehow translate across the species barrier. "We're almost there," he said repeatedly. "Just hang on. Dr. Mitchell is going to take care of you. You're going to be okay. Both of you, I promise." Whether the dogs understood his words or simply responded to the soothing cadence of his voice couldn't determine, but it seemed to help. The whimpering from Pip's carrier diminished slightly. As pulled into the parking lot of the animal shelter, he immediately spotted Dr. Sarah Mitchell standing at the entrance. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun and an expression of focused determination. She wore scrubs under her open lab coat, suggesting she'd come directly from clinical work. Behind her stood two veterinary technicians and a volunteer, all assembled and ready, clearly primed by Dr. Mitchell for the incoming emergency. Had barely cut the engine before Dr. Mitchell was at his window, leaning down to look inside the cruiser. These are the animals, she asked, her professional demeanor evident but her eyes conveying deep compassion. Yes, confirmed, opening his door. This is Honey, that's what I've been calling her, and her puppy Pip. She's in rough shape. Infected leg wound, severe malnutrition, signs of shock. The puppy is marginally better but still critical. Dr. Mitchell moved immediately to the back of the cruiser and opened the rear door. She examined the carriers with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades working with animals. Her expression grew progressively more concerned as she assessed what she was seeing. How long has she been like this? Dr. Mitchell asked, already reaching for the first carrier. According to someone who's been observing her, approximately 3 months since her injury, replied. The puppy is about 6 weeks old. She's been producing milk while severely malnourished, which means she's been literally sacrificing her own body to keep the puppy alive. Dr. Mitchell closed her eyes for a moment, processing this information. When she opened them again, there was fierce determination in her gaze. All right, let's get them inside. We need to move carefully but quickly. I want baseline blood work, X-rays, and full medical assessment before we decide on treatment protocols. The team sprang into action with impressive coordination. One technician carefully lifted Honey's carrier while another took Pip's. They moved through the shelter with purpose, Dr. Mitchell leading the way, followed though he realized he was technically off duty now and had no real reason to remain. But he couldn't leave. He needed to see them settled. He needed to know they were in good hands. They passed through the main shelter area, a space filled with kennels, barking dogs, and the ambient noise of animal facility operations. Had visited here before and knew that this crowded, stressful environment was the last thing Honey and Pip needed right now. But Dr. Mitchell led them in the opposite direction, down a quieter hallway toward what appeared to be a medical wing. I'm setting them up in our recovery isolation room, Dr. Mitchell explained as they walked. Quiet, temperature-controlled, minimal stress will keep them together. I'm not separating them unless there's a medical emergency that requires it. The bond between them is clearly significant, and separation could cause additional trauma. She opened a door to a spacious, clean room equipped with comfortable bedding, heating lamps, and medical monitoring equipment. It was nothing like the kennels in the main facility. It was a sanctuary. The carriers were carefully opened. Honey emerged slowly, her movements tentative and painful. She immediately began sniffing the room, assessing this new environment. Pip followed his mother's lead, staying close to her. When Dr. Mitchell gently placed fresh water and soft food within reach, Honey approached cautiously. She lapped at the water with desperate thirst, then turned her attention to the food. High-calorie, specially formulated for dogs with severe malnutrition. We have to be careful not to overwhelm her digestive system, Dr. Mitchell cautioned, gently limiting Honey's access to the food. Years of starvation mean her body needs to readjust gradually. Too much food too fast could actually harm her. She then performed a preliminary physical examination, her hands moving with gentle competence as she assessed Honey's condition. Watched from the doorway, seeing the veterinarian's concern deepen with each discovery. The infected leg wound was indeed serious, drainage visible, inflammation extensive. Honey's ribs were so prominent they looked like they might pierce the skin. Her heart rate was elevated, her breathing shallow. She's in critical condition, Dr. Mitchell said quietly, continuing her examination. But she's stable enough for aggressive treatment. If we hadn't brought her in today, I'd estimate she had 2 weeks, maybe 3, before her body simply gave out. The infection alone could have gone septic. Pip received a similarly thorough examination. Thankfully, the puppy appeared to have fewer acute medical issues, though the malnutrition was significant. Dr. Mitchell seemed cautiously optimistic about Pip's prognosis. "I'm going to start her on IV fluids immediately," Dr. Mitchell said, preparing equipment, "and antibiotics for the infection, pain management. We'll do blood work to check for other issues, parasites, organ damage, anything else we need to address." As Dr. Mitchell began setting up the IV line, something shifted in the room. Honey, watching her puppy being handled and examined, suddenly became agitated. She struggled to her feet despite obvious pain, her protective instincts overriding her exhaustion and illness. She positioned herself next to Pip, watching every movement Dr. Mitchell made with fierce vigilance. "It's okay, Mama," Dr. Mitchell said softly, speaking to Honey in the same tone had used earlier. "I'm helping your baby. I'm not going to hurt him. You're both safe now." There was something profoundly moving about watching Dr. Mitchell, a woman in professional authority, armed with medical knowledge and scientific training, speaking with such tenderness to a frightened dog. It reinforced something had come to understand. Genuine compassion didn't require perfect circumstances or ideal conditions. It required only the willingness to see another being's suffering and choose to respond with kindness. The IV line was successfully placed. Antibiotics were administered. Honey settled back down, now positioned so she could see her puppy at all times. Dr. Mitchell draped a soft blanket over both animals, creating a cocoon of comfort and security. "I'm going to stay here for a while," Dr. Mitchell announced, pulling up a chair. "Just to monitor them, make sure the IV is flowing properly, watch for any immediate complications. They've been through trauma. They need to know they're safe." Felt something shift inside his chest. He'd made the right call. Whatever consequences his unconventional approach to procedure might carry, he'd made the absolutely right call. These animals were in the best possible hands now. They had a genuine chance. "Thank you," said simply, "for believing me, for taking them on, for caring this much." Dr. Mitchell looked up from where she was monitoring the IV drip. "Officer, this is exactly why I took this job, to make sure that animals like these, animals with stories as profound as what you've described, get every opportunity to survive and thrive. Thank you for bringing them to me instead of just processing them through standard channels." As turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. He looked back at Honey and Pip, now resting under Dr. Mitchell's watchful care, and he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in hours. Whatever happened next, whether they survived, whether they recovered, whether they found permanent homes, these two had been given a chance, and sometimes giving someone a chance was all that mattered. The first 48 hours at Richmond Animal Care and Control were critical. A threshold moment that would determine whether Honey and Pip would survive or whether their extraordinary journey would end in heartbreak. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had essentially moved into the shelter, sleeping in a cot in her office and checking on the animals every hour. The medical team she'd assembled worked with laser-focused intensity, treating Honey and Pip like these two animals represented the entire mission of animal rescue. The blood work revealed the catastrophic damage that months of starvation and infection had inflicted on Honey's body. Her white blood cell count was critically elevated, indicating severe infection and immune system stress. Her hemoglobin levels suggested moderate anemia from blood loss and nutritional deficiency. Her liver and kidney function tests showed concerning abnormalities. The X-rays of her injured leg revealed a fracture that had healed improperly. The bone had knitted together at an odd angle, which explained the limp and persistent pain. The infection surrounding that injury was spreading, though not yet at the septic stage that would have been immediately fatal. "She's basically held together by willpower and maternal instinct," Dr. Mitchell told her team during a morning briefing that attended after stopping by before his shift. "Her body is in crisis mode across multiple systems, but here's what gives me hope: she's a fighter. Her immune system is trying to respond. She's not in organ failure, and most importantly, she wants to live. I can see it in her eyes." The treatment protocol was aggressive but carefully calibrated. Honey received broad-spectrum antibiotics targeting the leg infection. Pain management medications allowed her to move without constant agony. Fluids continued to restore her hydration. Special therapeutic food, high in calories and nutrients but gentle on her recovering digestive system, was introduced in small, frequent meals. Dr. Mitchell personally supervised every aspect of her care, understanding that the difference between recovery and death might come down to subtle details. Pip, fortunately, was responding more rapidly to treatment. The puppy's youth and relatively better starting condition meant his body could rebound faster. Within 36 hours of arrival, Pip was noticeably more energetic. He began playing with toys placed in the recovery room, pouncing on them with puppy enthusiasm that suggested his natural joy was beginning to override his survival trauma. He ate eagerly from the specially formulated puppy food, his tiny stomach accepting nourishment without the complications his mother faced. But what struck everyone on the medical team most profoundly was the relationship between mother and son. Honey refused to eat unless Pip was nearby and visibly healthy. If the puppy became fussy or seemed unwell, Honey would become agitated despite her pain and exhaustion. The connection between them transcended biology. It was pure emotional bonding, a testament to the maternal devotion that had kept them both alive through impossible circumstances. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" One of the veterinary technicians, a woman named Jennifer who'd been working at the shelter for 7 years, asked Dr. Mitchell on the third day. Once, Dr. Mitchell replied thoughtfully. "A cat who'd survived a fire with her kittens, but that was different. This," she gestured toward the recovery room where Honey and Pip were resting together, the mother's body curved protectively around her baby. "This is extraordinary. This is a level of devotion that challenges our understanding of animal consciousness. She's not just protecting her offspring on instinct. She's actively choosing her baby's welfare over her own survival. That's love, Jennifer. That's actual, conscious, deliberate love." By day 5, visible changes were occurring. Honey's coat, which had been matted and filthy, began to show improvement as her body directed resources toward healing. The shelter staff gently brushed her fur, carefully working through the mats while Honey rested. The process was painful. Her skin was sensitive and raw beneath the matted sections, but with pain medication and patience, the staff was able to gradually restore her appearance. Beneath all that grime and damage was a beautiful dog, a golden brown coat with lighter markings around her muzzle and eyes, a sturdy frame that suggested she'd been a healthy, well-proportioned animal before her 3 months of suffering. On day 7, something miraculous happened. Honey ate an entire meal without prompting and without immediately checking on Pip afterward. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Dr. Mitchell understood its significance. It meant Honey was beginning to believe in her own survival. She was beginning to trust that her baby was safe, that her maternal obligations could be temporarily relaxed, that she could focus on her own healing. The leg wound showed dramatic improvement. The infection, aggressively treated with antibiotics, was receding. The inflammation decreased daily. The drainage that had been constant became intermittent, then sporadic. Dr. Mitchell began discussing the possibility of surgical intervention to properly reset the bone, but first, Honey needed to be in better general health to survive anesthesia. That meant more time, more careful nutrition, more gentle rehabilitation. 2 weeks into their stay, Dr. Mitchell decided to conduct an experiment. She placed Honey and Pip in a larger recovery space, still quiet and controlled, but with more room to move around. She wanted to see if Honey could begin light exercise, if her muscles could start the long process of rebuilding strength. What happened over the following hours was nothing short of miraculous. Honey, moving carefully but with obvious purpose, began to explore her expanded territory. Her limp was still pronounced, still evident, but her movements carried less pain. She investigated every corner of the space, seemed to understand that this was safe territory, and then she did something that brought tears to everyone's eyes. She played with Pip. Not vigorous play, Honey was still too weak and damaged for that, but gentle, tentative interaction. She nuzzled her puppy. She allowed Pip to pounce on her in that exaggerated way puppies do, without snapping or showing irritation. She even appeared to be smiling, that distinctive dog smile that comes from genuine happiness and contentment. "Look at this," Jennifer whispered to, who'd again stopped by to check on the animals. "Look at her, she's actually happy. After everything she's been through, she's actually experiencing joy." Felt his eyes burning with tears. The transformation was remarkable. The skeleton, thin, desperate, infected dog he'd found behind the warehouse had been replaced by an animal who was healing, who was beginning to believe in a future, who was actively engaging with life again. 3 weeks into treatment, Dr. Mitchell consulted with a surgical specialist about Honey's leg. The consensus was that while surgery would improve her long-term mobility, it wasn't immediately necessary. The bone, though imperfectly healed, was stable. With continued physical therapy and rehabilitation, Honey could have a normal, active life even without surgical correction. The infection was essentially cleared. Her general health was improving dramatically. "She's going to make it," Dr. Mitchell announced to her team with clear satisfaction. "Both of them are going to make it. Honey's prognosis is excellent. Pip is thriving. This is going to be one of our success stories." But there was a complication that Dr. Mitchell hadn't fully considered, one that would add an unexpected layer of complexity to the recovery process. Honey and Pip had become so famous. During the second week of their stay, Dr. Mitchell had shared a few photos of the animals with the shelter staff and volunteers. Someone had posted one on social media. The image showed Honey resting with Pip curled against her chest, both animals peaceful and content in their recovery room. The caption read simply, "This mother survived 3 months on the streets, starving herself to keep her baby alive. Today she's healing. Today she has hope." The response had been immediate and overwhelming. The post had been shared thousands of times. Messages flooded in from people around the country expressing their overwhelming emotional response to the animal's story. People who'd seen the image reported crying, feeling inspired, deciding to volunteer or donate to animal rescue organizations. The story was resonating deeply with something fundamental in the human experience: the power of maternal love, the triumph of survival, the possibility of redemption and recovery. Dr. Mitchell realized that Honey and Pip had become more than just animals in her care. They had become symbols, emblems of hope, resilience, and the transformative power of compassion. What happened next would determine not just their individual fates, but would set in motion consequences that rippled far beyond the confines of Richmond Animal Care and Control. Dr. Sarah Mitchell sat at her desk on a Tuesday morning, staring at her computer screen in genuine shock. The photograph of Honey and Pip, the simple, unfiltered image of a mother dog resting with her puppy curled against her chest, had been shared 47,000 times in the past 24 hours. The comments section had exploded into an outpouring of emotion that she hadn't anticipated. People from across the country, from across the world, were responding to this image with visceral, genuine feeling. "I'm crying at my desk at work," one comment read. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. This is why I volunteer at my local shelter," another person wrote. "Stories like this prove that rescue work matters. Thank you for saving this mama and baby." A celebrity with 2.3 million followers had reposted the image with the caption, "This is what unconditional love looks like. This mama deserves the world." Dr. Mitchell hadn't posted the image herself. One of the younger shelter volunteers, a woman named Sophie who was studying animal behavior in college, had shared it on the shelter's official social media page with a detailed caption explaining Honey and Pip's story. Sophie had written with genuine emotion and journalistic clarity, describing the 3-month survival, the infected leg, the starvation, the puppy born under impossible circumstances. She detailed their medical crisis upon arrival and their remarkable recovery. And she'd ended with a simple plea: "Every animal deserves a second chance. Please support your local animal rescues and shelters." What had begun as a simple social media post was rapidly transforming into something far larger. News outlets were calling. Local television stations wanted to film segments. Online rescue communities were sharing the story, using it as evidence of why animal rescue mattered. Animal welfare advocates were citing Honey's case in discussions about underfunded shelters and systemic problems in animal care. Dr. Mitchell felt conflicted about the attention. On one hand, she was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of exploiting these animals' trauma for attention, even for well-intentioned purposes. She worried about sensationalism, about reducing Honey and Pip to a heartwarming narrative rather than recognizing them as individual beings with real suffering and real needs. On the other hand, she couldn't deny that the attention was already generating genuine positive impact. Within 48 hours of the post going viral, donations had poured into the shelter's accounts. $50,000 arrived in the first day alone, money that could directly support animal care, facility improvements, and staff expansion. People were calling not just with donations, but with offers to volunteer. Local businesses were reaching out, offering to provide supplies. A large pet food company contacted Dr. Mitchell, offering to provide free food to the shelter for a year. But more importantly, the story was changing people's awareness about animal rescue. Hundreds of people commented that they'd never really thought about shelter animals before seeing Honey's photo. Dozens mentioned they were now considering adoption. Animal shelter directors across the country reported that their adoption rates had spiked dramatically after the story circulated through their communities. Officer experienced the phenomenon firsthand. On his shift the day after the story went national, he was stopped 3 times by citizens who recognized his name from articles that had begun identifying him as the officer who discovered and rescued the animals. "You're the guy from the dog story," a woman at a coffee shop said, handing him his drink for free. "Thank you. That story made me decide to adopt. I'm getting a dog this weekend because of what you did." At the grocery store, a man approached him in the checkout line. "My kids saw the story about Honey and Pip. Now they're begging to volunteer at the animal shelter. You inspired my whole family." The attention was overwhelming, but it was also profoundly moving. Realized that what had begun as a personal moral decision, choosing compassion over protocol, had somehow transcended the individual circumstances and touched something universal in people's consciousness. Dr. Mitchell decided to do a more formal press release. She gathered information from Honey and Pip's medical records and treatment protocols. She compiled before and after photographs showing the dramatic physical transformation. She reached out to Officer and asked if he'd be willing to participate in interviews. She contacted Daniel, the homeless man who'd initially cared for the animals, and invited him to attend a media event where his role in their survival could be publicly acknowledged. When local news filmed their first story, it aired during the evening broadcast. The segment featured Dr. Mitchell explaining the animals' conditions, video of Honey and Pip playing together in their recovery room, and Officer describing the moment he discovered them. The story concluded with an emotional appeal. Every animal deserved a second chance, and shelters needed community support to make that possible. The response was extraordinary. The shelter's phone lines were flooded with callers. Email inboxes overflowed. The shelter's website crashed from the volume of traffic. Within a week, donations had reached $175,000. Volunteers had filled out applications by the hundreds. Local media was requesting daily updates on Honey and Pip's condition. But there was an unexpected consequence that emerged as the story grew. Adoption rates across Richmond's entire animal rescue community skyrocketed. Shelters that had been struggling to find homes for animals suddenly experienced unprecedented demand. Dogs that might have been euthanized due to overcrowding were instead adopted. Cats that had been in shelters for months found families. The viral story of one mother dog and her puppy had created a ripple effect that transformed the landscape of animal rescue in an entire region. Sophie, the volunteer who'd originally posted the photograph, was invited to speak at a local university about the power of social media for animal advocacy. She described how she'd simply wanted to tell Honey and Pip's story authentically, without manipulation or sensationalism, and how that authenticity had resonated with millions of people. "I think people are hungry for stories about love and survival," Sophie explained during the university presentation. "We live in a world that often feels cynical and complicated. When we see an image of a mother who's sacrificed everything for her baby, who survived against impossible odds, who's being given a second chance, we respond to that on a deep level. It reminds us of what matters. It reminds us that compassion is possible, that recovery is possible, that hope is real." Meanwhile, Honey and Pip continued their steady recovery. blissfully unaware of the media frenzy their story had created. Honey's leg was healing beautifully. Her weight had normalized, her coat gleamed. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by a gentle contentment and trust. Pip had grown into a healthy, exuberant puppy, playing with toys and interacting with the shelter staff with joy and enthusiasm. Dr. Mitchell found herself in an unexpected position. She was receiving calls from national animal welfare organizations inviting her to speak about shelter reform and animal rescue. She was being offered grants and funding to expand the shelter's programs. Suddenly, a facility that had been chronically underfunded and overlooked was receiving national attention and resources. But Dr. Mitchell remained grounded in her core mission. When media outlets wanted to do sensationalistic stories about Honey and Pip, she gently declined. When she was offered book deals or speaking engagements that would require her to leave her post at the shelter for extended periods, she politely refused. Instead, she focused on transforming the increased resources into tangible improvements for all the animals in her care. "This isn't really about Honey and Pip anymore," she told during one of his regular visits to check on the animals. "Yes, their story inspired people. Yes, their survival has changed the conversation about animal rescue. But what matters now is what we do with the attention and resources that have come from their story. Do we use them to genuinely transform how we care for animals? Or do we just bask in the feel-good narrative and forget about the thousands of other animals that still need help?" Nodded, understanding the depth of her commitment. "What's next for them?" he asked, gesturing toward Honey and Pip, who were playing together in their recovery room. "They can't stay here forever. They need homes. They need families." Dr. Mitchell smiled softly. "That's the question everyone keeps asking me, and I'll be honest, I've received hundreds of adoption applications. Celebrities, politicians, wealthy people offering to build custom facilities for them. But I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait for the right families. Honey and Pip have been through enough trauma. They deserve homes where they'll be loved not because they're famous, but because they're cherished as individuals. The applications will sort themselves out. The right families will emerge." She paused, then added with conviction, "And I know they will, because Honey and Pip have already changed people's hearts. The right families are out there, already thinking about them, already preparing to welcome them home." Adoption applications arrived by the hundreds. They came from celebrities who'd read the story in entertainment news. They came from wealthy individuals offering multi-acre estates and custom-built facilities. They came from politicians seeking to capitalize on feel-good publicity. They came from rescue advocates who genuinely believed they could provide extraordinary homes. Dr. Mitchell read through every single application, taking notes, evaluating each with meticulous care. Some were obviously unsuitable. A woman in Lowe's Angels wanted to adopt both animals and immediately put them in dog shows, believing their story could be leveraged for entertainment value. A businessman from New York offered a penthouse apartment, completely inappropriate for animals that needed space and outdoor access. A reality television producer wanted to film a documentary series about Honey and Pip's life, which would essentially commodify their existence. Dr. Mitchell rejected all of these without hesitation. She wasn't interested in finding homes that would maximize publicity or profit from the animal's story. She was looking for something far more important: genuine love. She was searching for families that saw Honey and Pip not as symbols or media opportunities, but as individual beings deserving of authentic family connection. Weeks passed. Dr. Mitchell continued her careful evaluation. She conducted phone interviews with promising applicants. She asked detailed questions about their living situations, their experience with animals, their motivations for adoption. She was looking for signs of genuine compassion, not performative kindness. She wanted to find families that understood the responsibility of caring for traumatized animals. Then one application arrived that made Dr. Mitchell pause. The applicant was Hayes, a 64-year-old retired elementary school teacher from a rural area outside Richmond. The application was simple and heartfelt, written in careful handwriting rather than typed. Described her home, a farmhouse on 15 acres with a barn, pastures, a creek for swimming, and plenty of space for animals to run and play. She mentioned that she'd lost her beloved golden retriever, Max, a year ago. She'd been grieving deeply, struggling to find purpose after losing not only her pet, but also her career identity. But what caught Dr. Mitchell's attention most profoundly was this passage from his letter. "I saw Honey's photograph and something inside me recognized her. I saw a mother who'd survived impossible circumstances, who'd sacrificed everything for her child. And I saw myself, someone who's learned that love isn't about perfect circumstances or optimal conditions. It's about showing up. It's about committing to care even when things are difficult. I believe Honey and I have something to teach each other. I believe we can heal together." Dr. Mitchell read the letter 3 times, feeling something shift inside her chest. This woman understood. She wasn't looking for a heartwarming pet to fill a void. She was looking for a connection, a mutual journey of healing. She was seeing Honey not as a rehabilitation project, but as a kindred spirit. But there was another complication. Had mentioned her grandson, Daniel, a 16-year-old who'd been dealing with the aftermath of his parents' recent divorce, had custody of him during school weeks, and he'd been withdrawn and struggling. The application noted that believed animals, particularly Honey and Pip, might help bring Daniel out of his isolation and help him reconnect with life. Dr. Mitchell made a decision. She called and arranged a visit to the farm. She wanted to see the home in person. She wanted to meet Daniel. She wanted to feel whether this was the right match. The farm was everything had described and more. Rolling pastures stretched toward tree-lined horizons. Wildflowers grew in uncultivated sections. The creek ran clear and cool, perfect for dogs to wade and swim. The farmhouse was modest but immaculately maintained, with wide porches and open spaces. It was the kind of place where animals could genuinely thrive, where they could run free and experience joy without constant restriction. Was waiting on the porch when Dr. Mitchell arrived. She was a woman with kind eyes, gray hair, and the calm presence of someone who'd spent decades working with children. When she embraced Dr. Mitchell, there was genuine warmth in the gesture. Daniel emerged from the house tentatively. He was tall for 16, with the slightly withdrawn posture of an adolescent dealing with family trauma. But when mentioned Honey and Pip, something flickered in his expression, a spark of interest that suggested he wasn't completely unreachable. "They're really nice," he asked quietly. "They're extraordinary," Dr. Mitchell assured him. "Honey's been through so much, but she has this gentle soul. Pip is exuberant and playful. They need a family that understands they're not just pets, they're beings with histories and emotional needs." Took Dr. Mitchell on a tour of the property. They walked past the barn where kept 2 horses. They visited the pastures where she'd been considering getting chickens. They stood by the creek and described her vision, a sanctuary where rescued animals could recover and thrive. I've been thinking since reading their story, explained, that maybe this is what I'm supposed to do. I spent 40 years teaching children. Maybe it's time I dedicated myself to nurturing animals. Maybe Honey and Pip could be the beginning of something bigger. By the end of the visit, Dr. Mitchell knew this was the right match. This was a family that could offer not just physical care but emotional understanding. This was a home where Honey and Pip wouldn't just survive, they would genuinely flourish. The adoption was finalized in a small ceremony at the shelter. Media outlets requested coverage, but politely requested privacy for the event itself. Instead, she agreed to do one interview after the animals had settled into their new home. When Honey and Pip were loaded into his vehicle for the drive to the farm, something remarkable happened. Honey, who'd been anxious during previous transport, settled calmly. Pip, sensing his mother's peace, stopped whimpering. It was as if they recognized that this transition, unlike previous ones, was meant to be permanent. They were going home. 3 weeks later, granted an interview to a local journalist. She showed photographs of Honey and Pip on the farm, Honey running through the pasture, her gait now nearly normal, her coat gleaming in the sunlight. Pip swimming in the creek, his body strong and healthy. And in several photographs, both animals were interacting with Daniel. The teenager was smiling, genuinely smiling, while playing with the dogs. "They've changed our family," said simply during the interview. "Honey has taught me that recovery is possible, that wounds can heal, that trust can be rebuilt. And Daniel, he was withdrawn, grieving, lost in his own pain. But caring for these animals has given him purpose. It's given him a reason to get up in the morning." The impact of Honey and Pip's adoption rippled through the rescue community, became an unexpected advocate for animal adoption. She began volunteering with local shelters, helping to place other rescued animals. Daniel started a social media account documenting Honey and Pip's life on the farm, and in doing so, he inspired dozens of other people to consider adoption. But perhaps most significantly, Story sparked a conversation about systemic change. She began advocating for increased funding for animal shelters. She spoke at city council meetings about the need for better animal welfare legislation. She partnered with Dr. Mitchell to develop educational programs about responsible pet adoption. Within 6 months, Richmond had passed new animal welfare legislation inspired directly by Honey and Pip's story. The new laws allocated specific funding for stray animal care and recovery. They established standards for shelter conditions and humane euthanasia policies. They created incentives for adoption and foster programs. When the legislation was signed into law, Dr. Mitchell, officer, and even Daniel were invited to the signing ceremony. Brought Honey and Pip, and the animals served as living reminders of why the legislation mattered. This law exists because of one dog's determination to survive, one officer's decision to show compassion, one veterinarian's commitment to excellence, and one family's willingness to transform grief into healing, the city councilman said during the ceremony. Honey and Pip represent the best of what we can be when we choose love over indifference. As drove home that evening, Honey resting her head on the back seat while Pip played with a toy, she reflected on the extraordinary journey. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow focused on loss. Today, she was part of something far larger, a movement that was genuinely changing how society treated vulnerable animals. and it had all started with one mother dog's desperate leap into a police car. Exactly 1 year after Officer first discovered Honey packing frantically behind the abandoned warehouse, Dr. Sarah Mitchell organized a special reunion event at Richmond Animal Care and Control. The facility had remarkable transformations in that year. The medical wing had been expanded significantly, funded by donations that continued to flow in because of Honey and Pip's story. New kennels had been constructed with improved lighting, better ventilation, and more spacious accommodations. The staff had nearly doubled, with additional veterinarians, technicians, and care workers dedicated to animal welfare. But this wasn't a celebration about the shelter's improvements. Dr. Mitchell had something far more personal and meaningful in mind. She wanted to bring together the individuals whose actions and choices had created the extraordinary chain of events, people whose individual decisions had ultimately transformed not just two animals' lives, but the entire landscape of animal rescue in their community and beyond. The invitation went out to Officer, of course, to Daniel, the homeless man who'd first cared for Honey and Pip with whatever meager resources he could gather, to Dr. Mitchell's medical team who'd worked tirelessly during those critical first weeks, to Sophie, the young volunteer whose social media post had sparked the viral movement, and most importantly to Hayes and her grandson Daniel, who would bring Honey and Pip themselves. When Honey and Pip arrived at the shelter on that warm July afternoon, exactly 1 year after their rescue, the transformation was absolutely stunning. Honey's coat gleamed with health and vitality, the golden brown fur now shimmering with luminous beauty. She moved with confidence and grace, the limp that had defined her suffering nearly imperceptible. Her eyes, which had once burned with desperate survival instinct, now reflected peace, contentment, and deep wisdom. She was no longer a starving, terrified stray. She was a beloved member of a family, secure in the knowledge that she was cherished. Pip had grown into a robust, healthy young dog, his puppy energy channeled into athletic exuberance. He moved with the unguarded joy of an animal who'd never known deprivation, who'd been nurtured through his most vulnerable period by both his mother and a family that adored him. There was no lingering trauma visible in his behavior, just pure canine happiness. When Honey saw Officer across the shelter's grassy yard, something extraordinary happened. The dog's entire body erupted into motion. She surged forward, tail wagging with such intensity that her entire posterior was involved in the movement. She didn't walk till she practically floated, all four paws barely touching the ground. When she reached him, she stood on her hind legs and placed her front paws on his shoulders, her face at the same level as his. Who'd maintained his professional police demeanor through all the media attention and public recognition, simply lost it. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he embraced the dog, whispering words that were inaudible to the assembled group, but whose emotional content was unmistakable. Honey whined softly, nuzzling his face, licking his tears, communicating her recognition and gratitude in the universal language of animal affection. Pip, not wanting to be left out, threw himself at with all the enthusiasm of a younger sibling demanding attention. The officer knelt down, and both dogs covered him with affection, Honey with her gentle, knowing tenderness, Pip with his exuberant puppy kisses. It was a moment of pure connection that transcended species and circumstance. Approached with tears of her own, she took his hands and held them firmly. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for not giving up on her. Thank you for caring enough to step outside the system. Thank you for changing our lives." She changed my life, replied, his voice thick with emotion. Both of them have, seeing what's possible when we choose compassion. That's changed everything for me. Daniel's grandson stood nearby watching the reunion. He'd been a withdrawn, grieving adolescent a year ago. Now, at 17, he carried himself with quiet confidence. He was wearing a volunteer shirt from the animal shelter. It turned out he'd begun volunteering regularly at the facility, combining his passion for photography with his love for the animals. He spent his weekends documenting rescue stories, creating content that had gone viral on social media and inspired hundreds of additional adoptions. I've been thinking about studying animal rehabilitation in college, Daniel mentioned too. Honey and Pip kind of showed me what I want to do with my life. I want to help animals that have been hurt and traumatized the way they were. Dr. Mitchell gathered everyone in a circle, staff members, volunteers, supporters, and the key figures who'd been part of Honey and Pip's journey. She'd prepared remarks but found herself too emotional to deliver them formally. Instead, she spoke from the heart. A year ago, we rescued 2 animals from desperate circumstances, she began. But I think what's really happened is that they've rescued us. They've rescued all of us from complacency, from indifference, from the belief that individual actions don't matter. They've shown us that one person's compassion can create ripples of transformation that spread far beyond what we could possibly imagine. She gestured toward one police officer decided to follow his conscience instead of protocol. She gestured toward Daniel, the homeless man. One person experiencing homelessness chose to care for animals despite having nothing for himself. She gestured toward Sophie. One young volunteer decided to tell an authentic story rather than a sensationalized one. She gestured toward and her grandson. One grieving family chose to transform their pain into purpose. And together, Dr. Mitchell concluded, these individual choices created something revolutionary. They changed policy. They changed awareness. They changed how society thinks about animal rescue. But more than that, they changed each other. They changed me. They reminded me why I do this work. That evening, the shelter hosted a formal commemoration event. Local politicians attended, including the city councilman who'd signed the animal welfare legislation. News media covered the event, not as a sensational story, but as a genuine milestone worth acknowledging. Honey and Pip were presented with special recognition awards, though of course, the animals had no idea what was happening beyond the fact that they were receiving attention and affection from many people. What struck everyone present was how calm and gentle Honey remained throughout the event. She accepted attention gracefully, moved through the crowd without anxiety, and showed no signs of the trauma that had defined her first year of life. She had been healed not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. She had been given back her faith in humanity through unconditional love. After the formal event concluded, as evening shadows lengthened across the shelter grounds, found himself alone with Dr. Mitchell, watching Honey and Pip play in the grass while Daniel sat on a bench nearby, observing with contentment. "Do you know what I realized?" said quietly. "When I made that choice to call you instead of animal control, I thought I was just trying to save 2 animals, but what I was really doing was saying yes to hope. I was saying yes to the possibility that compassion works, that it matters, that it creates change." "And it did," Dr. Mitchell affirmed. but not just because of you. It took all of us. It took Daniel's initial care. It took willingness to heal her own grief by healing others. It took Sophie telling the story authentically. It took the community responding with donations and support. It took the politicians being willing to create legislation. It was a collective yes to compassion. She paused, watching the dogs play. Honey and Pip didn't save themselves, they needed us. And in needing us, they gave us the opportunity to be the best version of ourselves. That's the real miracle, I think. Not just that they survived, but that their survival inspired us all to live differently. As darkness fell and the group prepared to depart, Honey approached one final time. She rested her head against his leg, not seeking anything, just communicating a wordless gratitude and connection that would endure long after this reunion event concluded. Ran his hand along her side, feeling the strong, healthy muscles beneath her beautiful coat, and he thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. Individual decisions made in crisis, guided by compassion rather than convenience, had created waves of positive transformation that continued expanding outward. Honey and Pip had literally jumped into his police car that day, trusting a stranger with their lives and their futures. In return, they'd offered society a profound gift, the reminder that love, persistence, and individual compassion could genuinely change the world, one animal at a time, one person at a time, one choice at a time.